I'm Cliff Ribner, and I want to talk to you today about several texts in the Old Testament and also in the New Testament. The texts in the New Testament relate directly to the texts in the Old Testament and make very clear that all the commandments that God gave in the Old Testament are affirmed and repeated by Jesus. He summarized them. It's brilliant what he did. Anyway, the three texts are, first of all, Genesis chapter 1, where it shows what our role as human beings is. God made us in his image, in his likeness, and commanded that we have dominion over the planet, so that we have effect, we are in charge, and be fruitful and multiply. He wanted us to flourish, and he wanted us to flourish in every way. And in Exodus chapter 20, there is a text of the Ten Commandments, which is then repeated verbatim in Deuteronomy 5. It's the same text, the Ten Commandments, in both places. That's how important it is. Those are the only commandments in the entire Bible that God makes very clear were written in his hand in stone. Nothing else has that level of significance. No other orders by God have that level of importance. Violating them is a mortal sin. That's what he was telling us. And in Deuteronomy 6, it's a prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. Followed by an additional portion of that prayer. That prayer, as I pointed out yesterday, is the central liturgy in Jewish worship. It's called the Shema and the V'ahavta. It's repeated in every service by Jews, no matter how religious they are. Very religious Jews wear tefillin, and basically it's stuff that they wear on their body that has that prayer in it. There's a thing they wear. It's a little box that is between their eyes, because in that prayer God says, love God. The commandment to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And what he's saying is, your soul is who you are. And you have those powers. You have the heart, which meant really the mind, the ability to think, and your might, which is your will. It's everything you have the power to do. And he gives you commandments on how to focus your attention on loving God. Loving God is the way to salvation or self-realization. That's what he's saying there. This is all emanating from chapter 1 in Genesis of telling man to flourish. And the Ten Commandments are there because those are the commandments you have to follow. Everyone has to follow, including the government, in order to remain free. It's the first one is, I am the Lord thy God who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And these are the things you have to do to be a free man instead of the slave that you were before I rescued you. And Jesus summarizes all of the Ten Commandments. He does it in one phrase. And Jesus doesn't talk politics. Jesus wasn't about politics, although he did make one very important political statement. To the extent that politics is involved in commandments, because laws are necessary to enforce some of these, he said, love your neighbor as yourself. That summarizes the whole thing. In other words, love your neighbor. Don't harm his property or his person. And it has implications for how the government should be, by the way. In fact, so does his phrase, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God's. What he's saying there is Caesar needs to keep his nose out of God's business. Caesar has no place in those things which are of God, including charity. Charity is something that we do in connection with our souls and with God. And socialism involves taking property from some people and giving it to others who haven't earned it. That's what socialism is. It's the opposite of meritocracy. And people who claim that Jesus was a socialist couldn't be more wrong. Socialism violates the Ten Commandments. In fact, all forms of collectivism do, because it says, thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not envy, and thou shalt not bear false witness. And it's impossible to have socialism without violating those three commandments. Every single communist country involves the politicians making promises of plenty to everyone that's going to be obtained by stealing from the rich. That's literally what they say. They promise that everyone's going to be rich because we're going to steal it from the rich. Except it never happens. We have experience of this in real life. We've had socialist countries that did exactly what that promise is, and they can't fulfill the promises. Socialist countries are always impoverished, and the way it's enforced is by terror, because the whole thing is contrary to human nature. Human nature demands that we each have property and that we are able to have a meritocracy where our deeds are judged according to their merit, and we're entitled to receive whatever we have earned. And to the extent we get things that we haven't earned, it's stealing. And what's involved in socialism is it forces everyone who is the recipient of stuff which has been stolen from the people who really earned it to give thanks to the Kaiser. In fact, that's who started socialism, really, the government proposition. Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. And in 1870, it's an unfortunate fact, all organized religions basically caved, and they were in favor of welfare, because they saw it as a form of poverty, a way of helping the poor. But it doesn't. It never helps the poor. And it's the opposite of charity. Real charity involves people giving voluntarily of their own wealth to other people in time of need. And the people who receive it are not receiving it because they're entitled to it. They're receiving it because it's a blessing from the people who give it to them, who are honoring God by doing it. When it becomes an entitlement, where the government has to give it to you, it corrupts all of that. And it corrupts society, because you have a situation where people are getting stuff that they haven't earned, and it's being obtained by stealing it. And that's what taxes are. Taxes are a form of theft. And the fact that the government does it doesn't make it any less of a violation of the Ten Commandments. In fact, the government must obey the Ten Commandments like the people, or it is an evil government. The Ten Commandments tell us how to even tell whether a government is evil. Is it inciting envy? Envy is the one emotion that is forbidden in the Ten Commandments. Are the people who are promoting the socialism in the government, are they inciting envy and hatred? And they always are, because the whole thing is all about envying the rich and taking from the rich and accusing the rich of having their ill-gotten property, when in fact, in a really fair country where the common law is followed, everybody gets what they're entitled to. It ignores the fact that we have such a thing as market rules. Under the rules of the market, everyone has their market power, and they're able to sell whatever they have that someone else wants to buy. And the way people become really rich is because they have a product that they've come up with, that they're able to develop, that other people want. That's how people actually get rich. It's not because they've stolen the money from people. And socialists, and Karl Marx talks all about how rich people just steal things. All businessmen are thieves. And it's ridiculous that you can't get rich by stealing that way. The people who get rich that way in communist countries are the politicians in charge who steal from everyone else, and they keep it for themselves. And they're complaining about income inequality. There's no country on the planet where there's greater income inequality than communist countries like Cuba, where the few people that are the politicians that run the thing have everything, and everyone else is impoverished. And they're not allowed to have a business. In Cuba, you're not allowed to sell stuff on your own. And that's exactly the opposite of what we have here in America. Anyway, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. That's exactly, as a summary of exactly what all the commandments are. And you're supposed to recognize that, but this all emanates from that Genesis chapter 1, where each of us has our own soul. Each of us is in the image of God. And socialism denies the value of the individual. That's what's inherent in it, that the individual is not entitled to what he earns himself. The state is allowed to take everything from him. In fact, everything, he's a slave to the state. That's what socialism is. Karl Marx says it explicitly. We're taking your property away. No, individuals are not allowed property. That's the definition of a slave to the state. the whole difference between free men and serfs, and this is true throughout history, has been that free men are entitled to their property and they're entitled to make contracts, and serfs are not. And that's why in our Constitution, the one liberty that's preserved in the original text before the Ten Commandments is freedom of contract, the right to make contracts. And the common law of contracts preceded the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution was deliberately written by its authors, our founders, as a contract. It's a contract between the citizens and the states. It begins, we the people. It's saying it's a contract. And it's supposed to be interpreted under the laws of contract. And there's been this notion by people promoting socialism in America. In fact, what they've used to justify all of these administrative agencies, which are nothing but basically collectivist agencies that take all the power away from businesses to run their own business. It dictates what they can do, what they can sell. It violates all the most basic rules of property rights, because part of property rights consist of the right to the earnings from your property and the right to control it. And those agencies take away control. They also take away control over contracts. They dictate the terms of contracts, and they dictate what people's allowed to say. The Labor Department dictates employment contracts. The National Labor Relations Board was established under the Wagner Act. And all of that stuff just takes away people's freedom to deal with each other as they want. And Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God's. That statement by Jesus is basically an order to Caesar as well as to God, telling Caesar, keep your nose out of God's business. And God's business consists of his commandments to us. We are part of God's business. We were made in his image. And the government is not supposed to do anything except enforce the Ten Commandments. To the extent it imposes more laws than are in the Ten Commandments, policing laws, it is taking away our freedom. Every time one of those agencies is set up, they have laws which create them, and then they are given the power to regulate. That's what it's called, regulating the businesses. And courts have created this fiction claiming that, regulation isn't enough of a taking to constitute the taking. What it is in our Constitution, the government's not allowed to take your property without due process of law and without compensation. And the courts have been pretending that regulation isn't a taking of property. But it is, in reality. It's a taking of the most valuable property rights associated with the property that is involved. And as of now, we have those agencies which have been created. They affect every business, every contract, and they've greatly diminished the wealth of this country. Even though we're the wealthiest country in the world, we would be even wealthier, and we would be even freer. We would have more freedom. We'd have more choices. Cars, for example. When you buy an American BMW, it's not like the BMWs that are sold in Germany. It's a different car because they have to, it happens to, the body shape is identical to what it is, but underneath the hood and the way that everything in it works, it's a totally different car. The German cars are, I'm just giving you an example. This is true for every product, but this is a very specific example. We have these federal government agencies which dictate all the details of the design of the car, even things like what the lights can be like. Not that the lights on the German cars don't work perfectly well, but they're not. If you brought a German BMW into America, it's not legal on the streets because of those agencies. They're not allowed to sell them here. It's called a gray market car. They have to be, if you bring one in, you have to have changes made to it to make it legal in America. And it's got much better performance. The American versions are junk by comparison, and I know because I've had one of the gray market BMWs. Totally different car from the American cars. That's just an example. The automobile industry, every detail of the design and everything in its operation is completely dictated by the federal government. And that's true for every product we buy. We can't buy anything that the federal government doesn't give its imprimatur on and say, yes, you can buy that. The manufacturers have to go to the government and beg for permission to sell it. And that is completely antithetical to the Ten Commandments. the Ten Commandments, because that's a taking. It's the government is stealing. The fact that it's the government that does it doesn't make it right. The government has to obey the Ten Commandments also. And under the Ten Commandments, the federal government's not allowed to do that. And it's even forcing the car manufacturers basically to lie, because they have to pretend that what they're selling here is the same thing they're selling in Europe, and it's not the same car. The German cars can go 150 miles an hour, and it's very safe. It's perfectly safe. Well, you try doing that with an American BMW, and boy, it's a dangerous thing to do, because the car is simply not up to it. It doesn't have the suspension to manage it. And the tires are, the whole thing is different. And that's true for every product. Our freedoms are taken away by the federal government with all of those agencies. And the car business is one that they have particularly gone after ever since the beginning, because leftists hate the idea of the freedom a car gives individual. It's the freedom to travel anywhere you want. Now, you have to obey the laws. You can't kill people with your car. But we could have autobahns here where cars go any speed limit. You don't do that on city streets, but we could have roads like that. And they're not allowed to build them. In fact, all the roads are built by the government, which means they're garbage. If the fact that all the roads in the country have been nationalized one way or another, and they've been socialized. But the whole idea of the Ten Commandments is for us to be able to flourish on our own, for us to be able to sell whatever we have without having to ask permission from the government. Because in every sale transaction, both the buyer and the seller experiences profit, which is remarkable. Adam Smith showed how that increases, each sale increases the wealth of the nation because of that realization of profit. And the profit is the extra amount above and beyond what it costs the seller to produce it, and above and beyond the value of the money that the buyer is paying. The buyer thinks he's getting something more than his money. He experiences profit also. So it's not just the seller getting this stuff at the expense of the buyer. It's a voluntary transaction. And that's consistent with Jesus' command of love your neighbor as yourself and love God. So Jesus was saying, love God, which is what that prayer in Deuteronomy 6 is all about. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And as I said yesterday, he gives instructions on how to focus on loving God, how to do it. That's what that prayer is all about. He talks about how you shall experience it in your body, and you experience the words as frontlets between your eyes, so that it's a commandment for how to meditate to achieve self-realization, which is what God wanted for us all along, as he tells us in chapter 1 of Genesis, where he says, let's make man in our image and give him dominion. And it's all just a commandment that we flourish. And those are the two things enabling that. The Ten Commandments, which are only in the English-speaking world. We have the common law, which enacts the Ten Commandments into law. It's law which only applies after the fact, so that you don't have citizens having to ask permission to do things. You have laws which, if you harm someone, that person can sue you. If you commit a crime, if you commit murder or theft or fraud, you can be prosecuted by the government for those crimes. And also, if you harm someone in doing that, they can sue you for the damage that you do. That's what our law of torts does. But the common law is one where the citizens are free. They don't have to ask permission in advance. There is no prior restraint on the citizens. And that's what all of those agencies have done. They've imposed prior restraints on all the businesses in this country, and they've reduced the amount of employment. Henry Morgenthau announced, when a whole bunch of them were created in the 1930s when Roosevelt was president, Henry Morgenthau at the end of it in 1939 told the Senate it was all absolutely worthless. It didn't achieve anything other than getting us into debt. And he didn't mention the fact that it also didn't reduce unemployment. Unemployment remained constant because crushing businesses in the name of helping the little guy doesn't help the little guy. Because the little guy wants businesses to prosper because he wants those businesses to want him as an employee. Because if the business can prosper, it can pay people more, and it will want to pay people more because it'll have more need for employees. That's how the real market works. Anyway, I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hope you like this video, and I hope you indicate that if you do, and visit my website, cliffordribner.com, and buy my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.